Salt and iron filled the air when she came ashore, the surf spitting like 100 small mouths, and the waves rolling away as if they feared to touch her boots. Her armor shone with the green-brown gleam of a bronze dawn, not the polished heraldry of Gondor, nor the burnished steel of the north, but something older and stranger that seemed to drink light rather than throw it. In her hand coiled a rope like spun sunlight. It hummed in a key no one in that valley had heard, and the sound folded into the old songs that hung from the eaves of Rivendell like drying herbs. Rain tasted on the wind, sharp as a memory, and there was a hush, as if the trees themselves leaned nearer. She walked from the water as if she had come from a long road, and when she spoke the words were plain and heavy and true. "I come from a place across the sea," she said, and the common tongue of men and elves took the shape of her thought as readily as a ship takes a tide. "I have learned how to make many voices listen as one. I will teach you what I know if you will hear me." Elrond stood in the high hall beneath windows that looked like living eyes. His hair lay dark and silver, his face was lined by far more than seasons, and his hands were made to hold the histories of the world like fragile glass. Around him stood kin of Elvensang and Dunedain, wary of one another, each wrapped in the weather of old hurts. Glorfindel's cloak still smelled of flame from battles long ended. A Northman bore a spear whose haft was nicked by winter. A woman of Rohan watched with a steadiness other eyes mistook for boredom. All these things shaped the room, the long table like a river of oak, where old grievances ran deep and would not be bridged by ceremony alone. They listened like lightning, with a quick curiosity and a greater suspicion. Elrond inclined his head. "You speak of unity," he said, "yet you set your foot on Eldar ground unbidden. Why should we trust a stranger's law when we have laws older than the seas?" She smiled, and the rope at her hip thrummed as if the answer were music. "Trust is earned by truth, not treaties," she said. "I bear a thing that will make of lies a shallow place. It asks nothing of blood, only of what men and elves will say. Let the rope bind, and the rope will untangle the secret places. Give me 1 hour before your council, and I will show you what truth does to cunning." A murmur rose, an undercurrent of fear that ran through the hall. The memory of Sméagol's whispers, the quiet betrayals of men, the sharp-eyed cunning of some elves who wear their thoughts like masks, made every throat a little tighter. To strip the private thing away was to risk the private shield. To make politics public could tear the fabric where parties were sewn together by old necessity. Yet the rope sang, and there was a clarity in its note that hooked at the mind. "Show us," Elrond said, and his voice was a measure like a bell. He did not grant easy faith. He offered the one test he had always offered to strangers, a chance to prove worth beneath the company of named witness. They walked to the courtyard. Night was a curtain. Thin and quick stars pinned their own small fires in the black, and the moon lay low like a pale coin. The river at Rivendell moved with a soft, impatient voice, and the scent of rain made the stone cool as a palm. Diana, so the elves learned her name, untied her rope and let it lie like a sleeping thing across the stones. The material glowed faintly, a coiled line of light. She took the hand of a messenger who had come urging a petition, a stout fellow from Lorien whose own name had been polished away by the hour. "Tell the truth of what you took from the wood," she said quietly. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The rope quivered once, like the first pluck of a vital string, then hummed. When the man opened his mouth to speak, his words came cleaner than a draught of mountain water. "I did not steal for hunger," he admitted. "I stole because my lord steward promised a favor in return, the favor named an orkhold near the river." The words hung like a lantern. The steward's face flamed with a sudden carved panic. He swore by the old name of his house, by the valor, by anything that felt like purchase, but the rope hummed and would not be lied to. The steward's protests crumpled into confession. The hall exhaled the sound of a thing released and lost, of a trust broken but no longer poisonous in the dark. It was then the first claws of war scraped at the valley's edge. A skirmish of orcs, foul, low, and more cunning than their station should afford, spilled from a stand of silver birches beyond the outer guard. They moved like stain on drain, quick and stinking, and they carried with them a note of purpose. Their leader wore a piece of dwarven chain, ill-fitting and arrogant as a stolen crown. A report rode into the courtyard. The orcs would be at the eastern pass before dawn. Diana's jaw stiffened. She moved with a swiftness that had not been planned. The rope coiled at her hip, and when she drew it, the sound of it drew the breath from men's mouths as if they had been struck. It was not an instrument of slaughter, at least not alone. It was a thing that made hands speak no lies. For all its gentleness, the rope could make a treason be seen. "Who sent these orcs?" she demanded. "Who profits from this raid?" No one answered. Every head turned to the steward, who had just confessed suspicion pooled like rain in leaf bowls. The steward's fists were white. "I do not know," he said. "I only know the coins weighed light." Glorfindel's blade flashed to his hand. "If coin greased the orc's palm, there is one who knows the name," he said, and his voice was iron. But iron alone would not draw a name from a man who only half believed it himself. The rope tightened in Diana's grip. She let its length run between her fingers, and a thin thread of gold light snagged the steward's shadow as if catching a wisp of smoke. "Stand," she said. "Stand before us." He stood. His knees did not hold him unashamed. The rope looped him gently, and the hum swelled until even those farthest felt a pressure at the back of the jaw as a wind presses a reed. The steward's eyes wet, his lips trembled. He could not hold the falsehood in the face of such a thing. "It was the captain of the men of the north," he said, "Theodred's man. He promised to take this pass and send word to a lord of the west. He thought he would bind me by fear. He thought me a lesser thing. He looked from face to face and found none friendly. 'I am sorry,' he said. 'Forgive me.' Words flew like torches then, anger, accusation, the low hiss of old feuds. A southern lord remembered trade snubs. An elf looked back on a skirmish where men had raised axes. Each memory found another and widened into a gulf. The rope's truth cleared one thing and opened another. Stripped bare of secrecy, the old wounds bled as cleanly and as painfully as if they had never been dressed. Elrond's fingers drummed a slow rhythm on the table until the sound matched the beating of hearts. He did not demand a verdict. He looked at Diana with the used patience of one who had seen the wheel turn and the same faces come and go. "You wield a terrible mercy," he said at last. "You make betrayal visible and thus naked. Some here will say that the cloak of discretion keeps wounds from widening. Others will say that light is the only cure." Diana met his gaze. Her eyes were not entirely elven nor wholly human. They held an ocean's depth and a soldier's steadiness. "I have seen worlds where treaties were forged in the strength of one purpose. I have seen tribes set aside pride to face a darkness greater than any single quarrel. It is not perfect, It will not make old enemies love one another, but it can make them stand side by side if they will place truth before the fear of losing advantage. There were faces that turned away at that. A Rohirrim captain spat softly into a corner of his cloak. "Who gives you the right to pull aside our curtains?" he demanded. "What do you know of the ways of the mark? Of the bonds of a rider? I know enough to know that if your riders do not hold the passes together, the orcs will take them separately," Diana answered. "I know that alone you are sharp and brave, but divided you are broken. I ask for a chance to teach not laws but a method, ways to make common purpose rout the pleasure of old grievances, the steward shame, the quick orc raid, the concession of the messenger, all pulled like cords upon the council. Some spoke for an immediate sending of riders to intercept the orc host. Others argued for a more measured watch, for secrecy. The notion of inviting this stranger to train or teach across the peoples seemed dangerous to many. A dwarf whose beard was braided in a manner foreign to the valley's ears declared that no rope could bind the craft of stone and iron. Elven eyes saw the rope's beauty and feared sublimation. In the pause that followed, the golden rope coiled at Deanna's feet as if awaiting sentence. The valley breathed, the sound of it like waves in a shell. Outside, the Orcost creaked nearer, like a storm not yet broken. Inside, the council had drawn a map of grudges that were less mercantile than mortal. Each point of the map marked a hope and a wound, a healed place and a fresh sore. To bind those points required more than strategy. It required consent, the most fragile of constructs. Elrond rose. He had the look of one who took counsel seriously because he had loved and lost much. "We will not hand our lives to a foreign will," he said slowly, "nor will we close our doors to aid when it stands at our gates. There will be a trial of method. If your way can stop the orcs at the pass and bring the captains to speak plainly, then we will consider wider teaching." He paused, and his eyes swept those assembled. "If you fail, you leave us clearer, perhaps, but less whole." There was an uneasy stir. Some leaned forward, hungry for the chance to end the orc threat. Others shrank from the risk of making their faults public. Diana's answer was a small smile like the flash of a blade. "Then let this trial be the first lesson," she said. "Let those captains be led to a place where they must speak truth to one another. If they cannot, then let the rope bind them until they learn." A messenger was sent, swift as shadow, to recall riders and to summon the captains named in the steward fear. Feet moved, armor rang, and orders went out with a crispness the valley had not tasted for long. The golden rope lay coiled like an unspoken agreement. The night held its breath. Rain tapped an impatient cadence on stone. The war that had been a rumor grew teeth at the pass, and the council, fractured and fragile, prepared to test a stranger's way upon its most stubborn sores. Elrond's hand lingered on a carved chair as if he weighed more than wood. He looked to Diana once, and in that look there was the weight of an old decision being made anew. The valley leaned toward action. Toward the trial, the stranger asked. The rope hummed softly, the note like a promise or a summons, and the council set its face toward the east, where orcs massed, toward a meeting that would force words into the open and make alliances either by the alloy of truth or the snap of old iron. Aragorn's hand lay on the oaken table, fingers splayed over maps that smelled of dust and lamp oil. He spoke with the quiet authority of one who has learned to wait until a wound has begun to mend before touching it. "We cannot march blind," he said. His voice was a steady river over stones, not while old treacheries yet fester in men's breasts. Around him the hall answered in a dozen tongues. A dwarf spat his disdain, the sound like gravel shaken from a boot. An elf's voice, thin and soft as wind through withered leaves, spoke of grief that broadened, not healed, with every step toward war. A halfling, small and careful, counted the cost in hearths and fields. Pride and fear braided together, and where they met the knot held the council fast. Diana watched them like a strange tree that had grown in foreign earth, tall, rooted, and bearing fruit none could name. She did not answer with law or prophecy. Instead she rose, the golden coil at her hip catching torchlight and scattering it like summer lightning caught in a web. The rope itself made no sound. It seemed to hum on the edges of hearing, as if it remembered a different sky. She walked the length of the table and laid the loop before Aragorn as one might lay a gift of bread. "Let truth be the measure," she said, and in that voice old men felt their youth recall its debts. Aragorn hesitated, then touched the rope. It warmed at his hand like bread been baked at dawn. He bound it in a simple knot around the wrist of a Gondorian captain who stood defiant and red-faced, Captain Halbrand of Belfalas, a man whose beard had been trimmed as if it feared no wind. Halbrand spat his objection. "My oath is to Gondor and to its line," he said. "I will not be bound by sorcery." That was the sound of a man whose private fear was edged with shame. Men who have shame will often choose pride to wear like armor. Diana's eyes did not leave him. She took the other end of the rope and made a half circle in the air. The coiling light ran like quicksilver along leather and bone and settled at Halbrand's chest as if answering a summons. The hall inhaled. What followed was not thunder or judgment. It was small, like the opening of a door in a room long kept closed. The rope tightened, not to bruise but to ask. Words rose up from Halbrand's mouth that men would have died to bury. He spoke of a night in which he had met men from the east under a moonless sky, of bargains whispered over a shared cup, of a promise made to spare his men's homes in exchange for a pass. He named no master, but his tone made the shadow at the world's heart palpable. The truth slid out of him as water runs from a cracked jar. Silence afterward was a blade that some turned toward themselves. The captain's eyes were suddenly younger, stunned by what he had let his fear bargain away. Men who had long trusted him in barracks and forge now met his gaze and found only a man who had trembled at the thought of pitiless slaughter. Some cried treason. Others said only, "We knew the coast would be beset." A dwarf, chest heaving, struck the table with a hand that shook the map. "Deceit!" he hissed. "You would trade our son's blood for a roof?" His voice carried the heaviness of stone slung from a high wall. Diana did not rebuke. She told instead a parable in the old way, brief, plain, and shaped for ears weary of debate. "There was once a river," she said, and the room fell into the cadence of simple myth. It ran clear for all miles, but met a hollow where the soil was sharp. A people there, seeing their crops failing, dug a channel and cut the river so that only their fields drank. For a season they rejoiced. They saved nothing but their own thirst. The high rains came, and floods found the new channel. Their homes went with the water they had stolen. Her hands made the motion of the river pouring itself away. "You may spare yourselves a winter's want by bargains with fear," she said, "but the winter will last after you have sold your names." Legolas spoke then, voice like a long wind through reed, asking whether truth wrought by force could never be forgiveness. If one is laid bare, the elf asked, is he to be flung from the company forever, or may the stripling of truth become the seed of better counsel? His words were not mildness alone, they were a question sharpened by sorrow. The elves, who had measured ages and seen treachery root where love had grown, felt their grief confirm a different rhythm. Gimli, who kept his anger like a smoking brand, was less abstract. A rope that makes men tell true is a tool, he said. A tool is turned against hands or used to mend. We will not cast aside the smith because he knows to use hammer and tongs. His sentence was short and heavy. He looked at Halbrand and then at Diana and bared his teeth in a grin that meant only weary readiness. But trust, he added, is earned, and there are debts that no rope will pay. The lasso did not make mere words appear. For some, it unhooked a ring of hidden loyalties, thoughts that had been woven into actions. For others, it showed something softer, a memory of a child's laugh, a night of frost saved by a neighbor's fire. Halbrand's confession opened a door from which more truth drifted, small stinking things that had been fed in darkness. A captain from Calenard haunt muttered of taxes stolen to pay for spears. A scout from the southern marches cried of spies who had promised false maps. Each unveiling drew blood or balm. People stepped back from one another as if fumes had been released. Some clutched their chests. The elf who had spoken earlier brushed her lips with a hand, and the movement looked like a prayer. Not all were pleased. A small group recoiled at the way their private misdeeds were bared. "You take from us our choices," one of the Gondorians snapped, "and make of every man a thing to be read." His voice cracked with the old fear of having one's soul displayed like coin for every passer-by to judge. Others, however, were disarmed by the new clarity. A young captain, Eldon, who had seen more fields than houses, stepped forward and knelt. "If truth be the path," he said simply, and his words were a step down from the ledge into which Halbrand had been hurled, "then I will follow that road. I have lied to myself long enough." There was a sound like cloth falling. Nobles and captains shifted their weight. To some, Diana's method was a cleansing. To others, it was a trespass of the deepest sort. Even Aragorn, who had the patience of seasons, showed a wrinkle of doubt. He asked her in a low voice whether the rope forced change or merely revealed what lay already in the marrow. Diana's answer was a look, and within it was no triumph. "It shows what the heart will not let loose," she said. "Change must be made of the will once it is known." This answer pleased some and alarmed others. In the hush, a man of the East rose, thin, dark, robes plain, but his bearing that of one who has bargained with men and come home with hands clean, but eyes different. He called himself Rashk, and in accents that tasted of sand and salt, offered a proposition that made half the hall shift like a herd half startled. Rashk spoke of his people across the wasteland who had grown tired of being fed fear by a master who cared only for dominion. He offered a truce. Men of the East would allow a company to cross their lines to the very shadow of Mordor unmolested if those who passed pledged to hear what they had to say and treat them without the ancestral scorn they had always known. The offer hung. It was not the surrender of arms, but a shadowed pact. Like crossing a bridge no one had built to the far bank. Aragorn's eyes narrowed, thinking of the trap that waits for the brave. The dwarves spat again at the very idea. Old hatred is like iron in the throat. When it is loosened, it tastes of blood. Yet Eldon and several others, men and women who had seen towns emptied by ravagers, who had buried kin in storms of flame, met Rashk's gaze not with the old heat, but with a cold calculation. "We may use that path to strike at the heart," Eldon said quietly, "or we may step into a pit. Either way, knowledge now favors us." Halbrand, humiliated and trembling, did not speak of joining such a venture, but the captain's confession had shifted the balance. Those who had been bound by lesser fears now found courage to propose greater gambles. Diana's lasso lay coiled by her feet like a promise and a threat, both. She did not command men to trust Rashk. She simply said, "If you are to pass into the shadow, go armed with truth as well as sword. Lie to no one in that road. Let the East know the faces of those who speak for us." So it was proposed that the company divide. One host, Aragorn's choice, reasoned and heavy, would take the road by which strength is measured, collecting arms, rallying small folk, and striking where the shadow did not expect it. Another, smaller band would take the eastern way under Rashk's uneasy guarantee to plead for allies and to root out bargains that poison the ground itself. The word allies tasted strange in some mouths. Allies of the East, allies of those who had once marched against Gondor. To cross that river of distrust required a kind of bravery that was less bright than charging banners. It required walking into halls where the firelight favored tongues already fat on rumor. Halbrand, his honor shattered, refused to be lifted by an uncertain hand. Many recoiled from Rashk's offer. Dwarf and elf and halfling, some who had never seen the East, found their faces folded like old paper. But enough, more than Rashk or Diana might have hoped, stepped to Eldon's side. They pledged to follow the strange woman, whose rope made men say what they would not otherwise say. They pledged to test Rashk's truce, to carry the advantage of truth into a place where falsehood had long been the currency. Torches were lowered and plans were made with the economy of men who know how little time is left for hesitation. Maps were redrawn with fingers that trembled, weapons were sharpened, the air smelled of iron and tallow, and something like the first green of a tree in spring, new resolve. Aragorn moved among them, his face weathered but not broken, drawing one last breath before the march. Diana wound her lasso and placed it at the captain's table, then slung it about her shoulder as a soldier might sling a cloak. She did not speak of oaths. She had revealed much and left less. She had turned hearts and torn others. The council had done what it must. It had split. At dawn, a column would set out for Mordor. It would not be the whole host, nor would it be the blind folly of those who think brute strength alone can unmake a shadow. Part of the company would walk the well-trodden road of steel and rally. Another part, smaller and steadier, would take the eastern pass under Rashk's uncertain pledge, with Eldon and a handful of others and the strange woman whose rope took truth by the throat. They would go into a land where old enmities waited like sharpened stones, and where a single false step could mean the undoing of many. The hall emptied, leaving a hush that had the feeling of a storm's eye. In the doorway, Aragorn paused and looked back. Diana met his gaze for a breath, and without words offered the only thing she could, not absolution, but the stark, honest hand of those who would face the shadow clear-eyed. He took it. Then the first boot sounded down the stair, and the choice moved like a practice thing, forward and unavoidable. The morning came down like a blade across the plain. Mist lay in the hollows, and the great shadow of Mordor hung permanently on the eastern sky, a bruised sun half swallowed by smoke. Where the road dipped toward the border hold, the grass was trampled into gullies and the palisade stood gored open like a tooth. Men of the hold had gathered in a ragged ring about the gatehouse. Their faces were a map of sleeplessness and old grief. Behind them, the new host had made a thin line, Rohirrim lances gleaming, dwarven shields flat-braced, men of Gondor arrayed with wary bows. They were half willing, half ashamed, their alliance a thing of suspicion sown hastily by need. Yet at the center of that uneasy host stood she who was not of Middle-earth, and where her shadow fell, men straightened, orcs came first like a tide of black water, sliding between the scrub and the burned stubble. Their cries were keening chords, their spears jagged with the crude wit of the East. They were not hundreds, only a host of raiders, but they had a ferocity sharpened by hunger and the command of a dark hand. They struck the nearest flank of the border hold, where a company of dwarves were hammering at broken beams and trying to clear trapped folk. The dwarf captain, broad as an anvil, bellowed orders into smoke. 2 or 3 of his kin were dragged from a fallen buttress by their beards. One lay still. A hush stirred across the dwarven face like a wind through ore. For a moment the dwarves wavered, their shield rows splintering inward against the sudden barbed line. Men would have given way, but the Rohirrim, true to the horse lore of their fathers, swept round with a thunder of hooves to hold the flanks. Diana moved like weather. She was neither shield maiden of Rohan nor kin of Durin, yet she wore both the patience of a general and the boldness of those who have known other sons. She spoke few words, and those she spoke were chosen like arrows. "Form a ring," she said to the dwarves, her voice curiously low for one who could command armies. "Men, cut the line so the riders may pass. Riders, make for the brow and hold." Her hand traced a simple geometry. Shield wall at the base, a wedge for the cavalry, skirmishers to the rear. It was not a miracle it was craft grafted to will, and the host took to it, because they had no other plan. The Rohirrim answered her with a cry, their horses rearing like storm-bowed reeds. The dwarves set their shields and their axes took a new rhythm. Even the Gondorian archers, stern and proud, angled their quivers to make the pattern she demanded. Tactics are a language of touch and sound. Diana taught with touch. She moved among them, laying a hand on a dwarf shield, then on a rider's flank, directing a staggered cadence that men read in instant. When she placed her palm against the great iron of a dwarf's buckler, the dwarf's eyes softened with the recognition of skill. When she leaned to a rider to show the angle of a lance, the rider felt an old song of the field return to him. The lasso at her hip hung like a foreign rune, but she used it sparingly. Once, a swinging band of raiders tried to run between 2 shields, and the lasso sang out, a bright loop that snared a standard and brought a man down without splintering his flesh. That capture, shown to the dwarves and horse lords, said more than dozens of speeches. Unity, she taught, was not a treaty, it was a timing. The battle turned at a dip in the road where a mound of rubble, still smoldering from some earlier assault, formed a choke point. Here the dwarves stood, their axes like teeth in a maw, and here the Rohirrim ran their horses in a crash that splintered the orc line. The sound was a cathedral of metal, the tearing of leather, the ringing of steel on shield iron, the hollow thud of bodies behind cloth. Blood and oil smelled sharp and old. Diana stood where the dwarf shield wall met the rider's last sweep, a living hinge upon which the whole host turned. From her came a steadiness that was not born of Middle-earth. It was something older and stranger. She moved through the fight like a current through reeds, gathering momentum, breaking it open, and then the earth betrayed them. A volley of crude slings and a clutch of sharpened poles knocked free a corner of the ruined gate. A heap of falling timber, displaced by an Orcish ram, crashed toward the dwarf company. In that instant, she was there, an arm into the splintering wood, a shoulder braced like iron. The timbers struck her, and she staggered, but the weight that would have crushed two dwarves lay instead upon her. The dwarf captain, face suddenly open with gratitude and dread, threw himself forward to wrench his kin free. Around them, the Rohirrim held their horses for but a heartbeat, then charged. The charge broke the line of raiders like winter-breaking icemen, and horses poured through the gap and tore as under a flood. She did not cry nor boast, but the impact had cost her. A smear of dark spread across her cloak where splinters had found purchase. She tasted copper and the desert salt of foreign winds. For a beat she was still in the maw of pain, not with words, but with a slow tightening of breath. A young rider, skin freckled with sun, saw her falter and moved beside her, reins in one hand, lance raised in the other. "Stand, stranger!" he shouted, more from hope than command. She smiled, an odd, fierce thing, and pushed him back to the saddle. "Go," she said, "keep the flank. Hold what we made." He rode into the fray, and the lines closed over the hollow she had made. If the moment had been only a rescue, the deeper lesson was this: each race had given of itself. The dwarves, who trusted stone more than sky, had leaned their shields to shoulder the weight of a woman's sacrifice. The Rohirrim had turned their charge to fill a hole in a stranger's defense. Men had shifted bow angles to cover axes. The chaos had made a new harmony. In the midst of it, Diana baited the enemy with what looked like a reckless thrust, and then withdrew, drawing them into a trap where dwarves waited with axes raised like anvils of doom. Orcs, who had thought their prey separated, found themselves between mail and mane and iron. The sound was as if the world itself closed its teeth upon those who would chew it. There were losses. No victory is without loss. A Rohirrim standard-bearer fell with his banner braided in mud. A dwarf youth, new to war, took a spear near the throat and went quiet. His captain swore softly and gripped the shaft like a man who has no other comfort. The Gondorian archer, who had stood on the watchtower, was knocked from his perch by a charging warg. He was dragged from the beast only when many hands, horse and hammer alike, drew him free. Diana moved among the wounded with a speed that looked human and a calm that did not. She cut bandages with a dagger made not of Middle-earth iron, but when she bound hands, she used the same mercies the host had learned to grant. The dwarf captain, who had seen countless winters and none such, gripped her hand and spoke in a tongue rough with soot. "You are blood and stone both," he said. "You are a stubborn thing." She answered with a look that asked no explanation. As the last of the raiders ran or were taken, the plain gathered a tired silence. Crows took to the burned fence, their cries thin as needles. The men and dwarves counted their dead. The Rohirrim set the wounded beneath stretched hides, and the slow-eyed healers began their work. The host, once splintered by suspicion, now looked at each other with a shared bruise. It was a small thing, and yet it was larger than any treaty. Comradeship had a taste, a hot iron tang followed by the cold of mutual standing. Around the captives, who whimpered and spat, the allies formed a ring. None of them trusted this peace. Fully trust in times of war is a fragile, forged thing. When the captives had been bound and led away, a hush fell as the leaders gathered. There was no great hall for such talk, only the battered gate and a small hill where the Rohirrim pushed their horses to stand and watch. Diana leaned on a broken pillar, her cloak damp with sweat and dust. The dwarf captain set his axe in the ground like a scepter and looked at her with the slow calculation of one who weighs ore. "You teach us not to be friends with a word, but with a deed," he said. The Marshal of Rohan, a broad-shouldered man with lines of worry at his eyes, spoke next, voice low and rough with the horse smell of his people. "There is courage in that deed, yet we cannot forget the cost." They spoke then of the raid not only for what it had been, but for what it marked. These were not aimless plunderers. They moved as if following lanes, carrying food, tools, and crude sacks stamped with a sigil none of them recognized in detail, but all felt in their marrow. A supply train, the dwarf captain said, would be a prize beyond measure. The Rohirrim marshal nodded. Mordor's hand reaches farther than its walls. If these men carry chain and oil and the like, then these roads are the veins of the shadow. Diana's eyes for a rare moment were like the sea before a storm, deep and impossible. She had not come to heal old hurts alone. Her plans had always been of motion, to cut and to strike, to seize opportunity as a farmer seizes a season. "It is a beginning," she said. Her voice could hold winter and sunlight at once. "We have shown that when we move together, old grievances are fewer than shared danger. We have tied our strengths. The cutting of their supplies will starve what stands in Barad-dûr. Yet such roads do not lie in a single place. To strike them, we must leave other boundaries open. We will force nations to look beyond their fences. We will ask you, dwarves, Rohirrim, Gondor, to change how you defend and how you foray. The campaign will not be the same as guard duty. It will ask of fields, of halls, of herds, of craftsmen." There was a silence so wide the hill could have swallowed it. Each in turn saw what she meant. The dwarf captain thought of halls emptying and sons who would learn the way of sword rather than forge. The Rohirrim marshals thought of banners leaving home for an uncertain season, of mares driven long and young riders hardened by campaigns across lands they had once thought safe. The Gondorian archer imagined roads that would be kept watched and villages taxed for war. Choices like these change nations. They renounce the soft comforts of the past and step into a future struck by the hammer of necessity. "Are we ready?" asked a voice not unkind, but sharp as a whetstone. It was not a question for a moment. It was a weighing. Diana lifted her hand as if to steady them all. "We are not ready," she answered plainly. "We will never be ready until we make ourselves so. But we can be brave with intent rather than brave by chance." She looked at each of them, and her gaze held a magnetism that drew out the best in the tired faces around her. "Cut their supplies, and we do not merely fight their soldiers, we fight their will. We force the dark to stretch its hands wide and thin. We make their wagons targets and their foragers walk like hunted beasts. Plans are made at such moments like paper ships launched into a gale. Men argued about routes and timing, the dwarf captain insisting on secret forays through the stony reaches, the Rohirrim marshal favoring long rides under moon and cloud. A Gondorian counselor spoke of scouts who could move unseen. All of these, stitched together, amounted to one intolerable truth. To strike at Sauron's supply lines would demand more than courage. It would demand a reordering of lives. Halls would be left unattended, herds driven into strange pastures, craftsmen sent along roads that would sting with danger. The decision did not fall like a judge's gavel. It settled like a mantle, heavy, inevitable, needed. When they rose, the sun was dipping, and the air took on that keen cold that comes from lands close to Mordor. Her wound had been bandaged poorly, yet she moved as if that did not matter. The host prepared to move. Scouts would ride at dusk. Dwarves would test a pass by moonlight. Rohirrim would muster a quick strike. The plan to strike the supply lines was born from the salvage of a raid barely repelled, and from a woman's small, dangerous mercy. As they set their little lights and sent their scouts into the lengthening plain, there was a sense that the border hold itself, so long a place of guarding, had become the launching point for something new. The choice lay before them like an unsharpened blade, its edge not yet true, but its purpose clear. Diana lingered at the gate wherein the last of the frightened villagers filed, watching as the night took the plain and the shadow of the dark tower seemed to lean and listen. The allies had been tested and had passed, but the testing had only begun. They were moving now, and with that motion came no return to what had been. They would strike at supplies, at the soft underbelly of Mordor, and in doing so, they would ask their peoples to change. The march would start at dawn. The first scouts were already mounted. The air over the encampment had taken on the smell of iron and old fear. Smoke from the bridge fires tasted of damp wood. The earth underfoot was churned to mud by feet that could not stand still. At the edge of the camp, a small band of villagers pressed close around a man who trembled like a tree in a storm. He had been among those who, when Diana first spoke, stepped forward with faces unmasked and eyes made honest by the lasso's light. For a moment, they had seemed touched by a truth that made them look once more at one another as kin. Now they cowered as if that truth had been stolen away. Above them, a thin shriek ran the sky, one of the Nazgul, circling like a dark wind. The sound was not merely a cry. It was an uncoiling of malice, a rusted note that made the back of the neck prickle. The riders hunched in black, their banners gone like emptied sleeves, and they hunted with a patience that did not need the sword. Where they passed, people flinched before the shadow, and the shadow fed upon the smallest light of hope until it seemed too small to hold. Diana moved through that small crowd like a current through cold water. The lasso hung at her hip, a golden rope that shivered faintly as if eager to speak. When she touched the man's shoulder, he flinched and then leaned in, because the rope had taught him to trust once. The lasso did not force him to speak. It only showed as a bright thing reveals what is already there. The memory that spilled forth was not wrought by Diana's hand, but by the man's own. Images of his boy, of a bread oven, of a time when his Lord had smiled. They were simple, and in that simplicity, they were more dangerous than any stratagem. For those moments of truth had begun to loosen the old ties of fear and feud. They had begun to make people willing to stand beside each other again. Around the council ring that evening, the captains argued with voices like colliding shields. Torches painted their faces in quick strokes of gold and shadow. A prince from the south, young, hard-eyed, and a man unused to sitting still, spoke with an impatience that smelled of leather and reheated meat. "Binding is not a theft," he said. "It is a cure. We can end this at once. You have the means, Amazon. Use it." Elven lords, weary as autumn leaves, listened with heads inclined so that their long hair caught the torchlight and looked like silver rain. The High King's jaw was a rule of stone. He did not speak hastily, but the captain's words found purchase in the minds of many. Sauron had answered not only with fire and blade, but with a corrosion that crept into counsels, a whisper that took the shape of counsel. He had learned to use fear as a weapon, to turn the memory of old hurts into new axes. He fed suspicion as if it were bread, and the bellies of wary men filled on it. "Think," said an older lord, voice low as hoar frost. "If a heart can be bound, then none may turn upon a comrade. A startled foothold wins a battle. The Nazgul will have no more prey. We shall be whole. We shall be safe." The thought glittered like a coin tossed at a crossroads. It promised the swift end of threat. It promised fewer nights like these, with packs of refugees held tight in the dark while the wind carried the distant trumpet of death. It promised victory, counted like coin. Some of the captains, men whose faces had been carved by loss, hooked their thumbs to the ropes at their belts and looked at Diana as a smith looks at a hammer. Diana's hand did not go to the lasso. Her eyes moved across the faces, and in that light one could see the miles she had walked. She had been raised on an island where free will was taught like prayer. She had no taste for the unmaking of the self. The lasso could compel speech. It could make lies fall away like brittle bark. It could, with a darker use, bind a will and hold it to a command. That was a power she had sworn she would never wield, to take away choice. "You mistake me," she said, and her voice was steady as a keel. No one could tell if she was tired or resolute. The lasso shows truth. It sets the heart open. But it is not a chain. To take away a man's choosing is to make a victory that is not ours. A murmur like wind through grain ran the ring. The prince's face hardened. "We will not win if we trust dreams," he snapped. "You offered hope. You gave us a promise. We did not come to watch the world burn out while we wait for men to become brave." Diana's hands were quiet. She looked toward the hills where the black riders had vanished, where the earth lay like a wound waiting to fester. "I offered hope," she said, "but hope is a thing men must take into their hands. I cannot choose for them." There was a crack then, a small fissure at first, like the sound of ice splitting on a pond. But in that moment, the camp changed its shape. Some men bowed in thought, some cursed. The prince turned away, and a cluster of captains rose like a sudden wind. "If not by yours, then by our own," he said, and there was no question in his tone now. "We will find some other way." So it came to be that the fellowship of the free peoples split on that night as easily and as tragically as a hand parting a cloak. Some remained at Diana's side. Their numbers were not small. There were those who believed in the sanctity of a choice, even when choice costs dearly. Others left with the prince, taking oaths that seemed to glitter with desperate hope. They carried with them devices of cord and iron, and a bitter certainty that any means were rightful that might save a realm. The small ways by which men banded together uncoiled like threads. Some were tied to the lasso's promise, some to the harshness of commands. The camp was a map of scars. Sauron answered quickly, as if he had been waiting only for the moment of fracture. The Nazgul struck not with broad frontal assault, but with a hunting that sought those newly unsheathed of old fear. They came in the hours of thin dawn and the gray breath between night and day. They looked for those who had, in the glow of the lasso, stepped forward into trust and then drawn back. To the watchers, who had said that binding would bind the fellowship, these hunts were a cruel lesson. It is easier to catch a heart that sits unbound than one that is hard as old oak. The riders took and left and took again, and each small loss was like the dropping of a stitch in a sweater unraveling spreads. But the corruption Sauron spread was not only in the night hunt. It was a whisper that worked during council, a thought that crept into dreams. Men woke sweating and suspected their companions of treachery. Ladens of past grievances were set about like wedges in a door, and every creak of the hinges sounded like an argument that must be won. The lasso's revelation of truth had given room for trust to take root, but Sauron's craft was to make trust seem a folly. He made the sensible road of fear look like the only path left. Thus, the captains who departed with chains and oaths felt not compelled by wickedness, but by survival. Diana saw that survival could be the most dangerous religion. She watched the prince and his cohort walk away beneath a sky the color of scratched pewter. They had no thought that they betrayed freedom. They believed they were saving it. For all their urgency, their leaving hollowed the center of any plan that required a united force. She felt the consequences like a physical pressure in her chest. The lasso at her side hummed lightly, as if it too was listening. In the nights that followed, Diana acted like a surgeon of morale. She used the lasso, but sparingly. She went among the towns that had been touched and lifted the curtains of fear from a priest's heart, from a smith's claws, from a woman who had been poised, trembling, on the edge of calling her neighbor foe. Each unbinding was its own small peril. The lasso showed too much at times. It revealed old crimes and old loves and the raw places where men bled. To watch a man confront the thing he hid was to watch something fragile either mend or break. Not all mended. Some, once exposed, recoiled and fled. Others knelt and wept in the dust. Her refusal to bind wholesale did more than test her. It splintered the fragile alliance that had been their shield. Word of the prince's departure spread like a winter fever. There were those who would not follow a woman to war, who would not bind the willful wills of men. There were those who would. Factions began to form around the idea of enforced unity. In a place where oaths had always been expensive, the promise of instant fidelity looked like a miracle to many. Many others looked upon it as a blasphemy. You could have ended this, the prince told her once, when the moon hung thin and cold over the plain. His words were not cruel. They were merely an enumeration of stakes. You chose to let us suffer. I chose to let us be free, she said. Freedom is costly, but it is a cost I will not remove by taking the choice itself. He bowed his head, and in that motion there was neither shame nor triumph. He turned away and walked back to his own. He carried with him men who would press the point of their conviction into battle. He would try to gouge order from desperation. Diana watched him go and thought of the many ways a war could be won and of the many ways it could be lost. Her refusal preserved a harder thing than an alliance. It preserved the principle that men could be persuaded rather than shackled. That principle required a different kind of warcraft. If she would not bind wills, she would have to break the means by which Sauron bound them. and that would require strategy of the old kind. Sneak and sacrifice, small, cruel gambits that took advantage of terrain and rumor. It required that she trust those who remained, hobbits and rangers, elves with lids like midnights, grim-faced men who had not known the luxury of naivety, to choose again when choice was called for. So the plan that took shape beneath the cold constellations was not one of a single sweeping command, but of 1,000 little severings. Teams would go to the places where the Nazgul hunted and cut them off from their lines of terror. They would seek the dark sorceries that smeared fear across the land and unmake them bit by bit. They would risk lives to pry open minds. They would set down the lasso as a scalpel, not as a yoke. Diana spoke with quiet authority, and those who stayed felt the weight of it. "We will not bind," she said. "We will unbind. We will take back what has been stolen one person at a time. We will not make slaves of men in the name of safety." There were those who swore to follow. There were those who left. The camp looked like a broken crest, yet the night hummed with the energy of decision. The Nazgul's shriek was closer, as if they sensed a run in the woven loyalties and sought to tear it further. Diana ran a palm along the golden coil at her hip. The lasso shimmered, ready to obey a hand that had chosen to never make slaves. She thought of the sacrifices she would ask, men and women who would walk into the teeth of a darkness to pull free those who lay half caught in its web. She thought of faces she had already seen unburdened by truth, and of faces she would see refuse that burden. She thought of the prince hard as flint, and of the possibility that in time he might be the very man she needed, or the one who would undo them all. The first order was given at dawn. A small band would ride out to the southern holloways where a Nazgul had been seen making its lair in a ruined watch. They would try to cut the source of a whispering charm to pull up the stone that fed the fear. Diana did not command in the old way she asked. Those who stepped forward did so of their own free will. She tightened her cloak against the wind and watched them go. The lasso's warmth was a lamp at her hip. Behind her, the fires of the divided camp smoked and flared like tempering iron. Ahead, the hollow, the ruined watch, the thin, hungry cry of a thing that did not yet know whether it would meet resistance, waited. Diana lifted the lasso a little, feeling its thread sing between her fingers, and the world seemed to hold its breath for the beginning of the first very dangerous work of unmaking what Sauron had wrought. She knew this gamble carried a steep toll. She knew it would not stop the Nazgul from hunting, at least not at first. But she had chosen a road that would ask of people the noblest and cruelest thing, to choose again and again in the face of terror. She stepped forward, and the band behind her fell into ordered chaos, for courage is an unruly thing that moves by fits and starts more than by any smooth plan. The Nazgul's wail rolled over the plain like a tide, and Diana's voice cut into it as she called them, those who would risk themselves for the possibility of a future not bought by bondage but earned by blood and trust. The hollow waited, and with it the first true test of whether freedom could be preserved without being made a casualty of war. The black gate stood like a wound in the world, iron teeth set against a sky that bled ash. Around it, the allied host crouched and trembled, a living river of banners' breath and booted feet. The earth smelled of smoke and sweetened blood. Horses stamped, and the lowing of men and elves and dwarves braided into one long, steady chant. Diana moved among them like a compass bearing true. Her voice was not the loudest, but it cut through the clamor. She laid her hand upon a shield, smoothed the fret of a bowed spear, and in that touch there passed a steadiness like the calm after rain. It was not sorcery that took hold, it was a remembered fact, planted anew. They stood together because they chose to stand. On the left, the Rohirrim drew close with their long, mournful horns. On the right, archers of Lorien took up their string again, their arrows trembling like a held breath. Between them, lines of Gondor formed and reformed, a living hedge of iron and oath. Dwarves shuffled into the gaps with axes bright as winter ice. Small contingents of men from the far marches, some distrustful, some grateful, pressed their cases to be heard and were heard. Where suspicion had been, the lasso lay across calloused palms and uncalloused ones alike. Diana wound it not to bind, but to bind purpose. With a loop and a wordless pull, she drew promises from the wary and opened a place for trust to grow. It is a strange thing to see fear unhooked and set on a bench beside courage, both treated as neighbors. When the first blow fell, it was not like thunder, but like a series of closing doors. The host of Mordor came pouring through the gate, a tide of dark leather and crude iron, banners that flapped with a hiss of flames. Their numbers were vast, and their hate precise. For a while it seemed the very air favored them. Arrows rained from towers, and cries rose like a second sky. Yet for all their making of dread, Sauron's strength was not only in steel, it lay in the small betrayals he designed to nurture. The whisper to a commander, the memory of an old slight held warm, the thought that saving a man was to risk a kingdom. He had governed fear into a kind of habit. So the plan unfolded that Diana had carved with rough hands and gentler minds. Not a simple charge, nor a shield wall to hold forever, but 1,000 agreements lived for an hour. Women and men, elves and dwarves, volunteers of no single nation, stepped forward. They were not knights seeking renown. They were names and faces that had been given few purposes, but now found one. Their task was to become the hinge upon which the larger wheels might turn. They would hold, not until victory, but until trust could be trusted in turn. They moved like gardeners planting a fence against fire, a thin line of volunteers, light-armored, with eyes lit by a steady inward flame, took the forward trench. Behind them, others braced behind others still. The reserves waited, not for orders alone, but for the sign of faith that they would be covered. In that small advance, 1,000 separate histories were knit. Men from the Haradrim handed brews of cooling herbs to Rohirric riders. An elven healer murmured old words over a dwarf's wrist. A Gondorian captain set aside a grudge and took the hand of a northerner. These were small things. They were also the things Sauron could not foresee. The first to falter were not the masses, but the agents of fear. Raiders fell back as their scouts returned with news. Men would not turn on one another. The air itself seemed to puzzle over this development. Where discord might have sewn a blade into a friend's back, there was instead a back turned to shield. Orcish commanders found their orders undone by the very soldiers they sought to command. In the grinding gears of Sauron's war, teeth slipped. One by one, units refused to take advantage of a brother's alarm. 100 small refusals spread like a stain of cold. In the heart of the fray, Diana stood with her lasso coiled at her hip. She did not fling it to snare leaders or to cast down beasts. She used it to pull the wounded out, to bind splinted limbs, to draw comfort from trembling hands. A Nazgul plunged close, its blackness a rumor on the wind, and yet those at Diana's side did not flee. They did not pray for miracles, they offered their arms to one another. It is possible that Sauron had never expected such defiance. Soldiers who would not profit from death, who would not let terror produce treachery. There came then a moment that must be named even if only in the mouth. A gap opened in the Allied line, a terrible, hungry hollow where a chariot had splintered the ranks and left the way to collapse. For an instant, the world could have tipped, but volunteers poured into that hole as if it were the most natural thing in the world to stand where danger burned hottest. A dwarf with a chewed beard sang a cadence of work. An elf whispered a child's rhyme to steady a trembling arm. A man who had lost a brother in a past skirmish took up a helm and gave surprised orders. They did not seek glory. They sought one another. When the enemy swept at that hastily made bulwark, they found not easy prey but a living wall. They struck hard and broke their hands upon it. It is not given to war to spare the brave many fell, but many more held. They held for minutes that stretched like years and yet shrank like a breath. And in those minutes, 1,000 other things happened. A messenger slipped through the press to tell of a flank newly exposed. An archer loosed a single shaft that cut the rein of a beast. A pair of brothers of different lands bore one another back to safety. Sauron's grand plan, so precise in its cruelty and cunning, had assumed fracturing, not binding. It had relied upon the old calculus of fear. It did not reckon with the arithmetic of chosen trust. The collapse of Sauron's designs was not an easy, sudden unmaking. There was no bolt of lightning to write his name from the sky. Instead, there was a softening, a strangeness in the ranks of his forces. Commanders shouted for assaults that did not come. The reserve line stood motionless, as if listening to something their masters could not hear. Word spread like a contagious courage. If men of Gondor could die in defense of an elf, then what stake had provided the fear? If a dwarf might lay down his axe to hold a human's arm, then whose counting of advantage mattered? The eye that had watched and weighed and corrupted found its gaze tripped by 1,000 mutual hands. At the Black Gate itself, the struggle shortened into a series of small, bright decisions. A company of Rohirrim broke from their ranks, and guided by a young captain whose mother had once mended a stranger's cloak, wheeled to strike where the enemy expected weakness. Elven scouts, sent to shadow an enemy flanking move, instead opened their ranks and welcomed the stranded sons of men. A dwarf war band surged to the gate's hinge and held it with a stubborn humor that threw even the dark-hearted into a kind of bewilderment. The lashing of blows made no difference against this new chord. Fear could not hold them apart when faith held in place. At last, Sauron's will, whatever it had weighed upon them, began to fray. His influence was a lattice-work made of small cruelties, and where one branch gave, another could not bear. Troops broke and fled, not always to survive, but to avoid the shame of being the one to profit from a comrade's death. The clang and scream of war shrank into isolated skirmishes. The armies of the free, though battered and sore, rallied themselves by the mutual count of names and faces they had kept. Victory was not silver and brass that day. It was the patient returning of those who had given one another a right to keep living. When the day ended, the fields were not the tidy prizes sung in triumph. They were scarred and singing with a sore, soft sound. Tents smelled of tea. Over a sputtering flame, men carved whittled tokens, and passed them in small circles like sacraments. They counted not captives, but the living. They built narrow pyres for those whose names were kept by others because they could not be kept by themselves. The grief was close and careful, like a wound dressed nightly by hands that had known touch. They honored the dead without ceremony's pretense, by tending to the living left to bear the mournings. Diana did not linger long in the field. Her work, for all that it had been martial, had been to plant a new way of being. She gathered the captains and elders, the voices that had risen through the smoke, and laid before them a simple thing. If unity had been forged by choice, it must be kept by choice. They set a day and a place and named a council, an assembly with no throne but with many seats. Its laws would be made of small promises and large witness. They bound themselves with tokens taken from the battle, a strip of a banner set beside a dwarf's hammer, an elven cord wound about a Rohirric braid. These were not mere symbols. They were agreements that could be touched and counted. The new council met where the land lifted and showed the sea, a ring of stones that were neither kingly hall nor fortress, but a plain place where eyes could be turned in many directions. There they wrote their first measures in a hand that would be read aloud by many voices. They declared that justice would not be the will of the strongest, but the sum of votes and the weight of witness. They pledged passage and aid across borders once barred. They set up a memory-keeping, not in words alone, but in quiet acts. Orchards to be planted for each lost company, wells to be named for those who gave their lives, and a yearly gathering where old grievances could be aired and healed. On the day she left, Diana walked once more through the rows of the wounded. She did not speak long. A woman from Gondor who had lost her son took her hand and said simply, "We will try." Diana smiled, the kind of small, rueful curl that has known both victory and the price of it. "That is all I asked," she replied, "that you try together." She fit the lasso across her shoulder and turned her face to the sea. The council's convening was not her triumph to keep it, was their trust to steward. She had taught them the architecture of unity, but not the habit of keeping it. That task would belong to them. She left a ring of people who bore promises more than power. They would meet in months to decide borders and to address the root wound Sauron had exploited. They would rewrite old debts and make new laws. They would be tempted more than once to let fear build new fences, but they would have seen how trust held in the smoke. As Diana's ship cut the gray water, sails taut against a wind that smelled of salt and guarded hope, the new council gathered to lay down the order of the next days. Their first ordinance was simple and forward-pressed: to ride together to the White Mountains and hear the pleas of men who had been silent. Their first pledge was to send aid to far places that had borne the brunt of the war's cruelty. They set down names on a scroll and passed it from hand to hand, binding themselves in small civics and everyday kindnesses rather than commands. And so the work began, not as a conclusion, but as a task that would demand courage every morning. The cost of freedom, they knew now, would not be paid once. It would be paid in the living memory of those who kept faith with one another. The future leaned toward them, not as a promise kept, but as a duty willingly undertaken.